Welcome back to the second day of Northeast Asia Peace and Cooperation Forum 2021. Good morning. My name is Lee Sang-hoon, researcher at the Institute of Foreign Affairs and National Security of KNDA. The forum is aired live on KNDA's official YouTube channel, KNDA Live. We have two channels, English and Korean. Please check out both and choose the channel you're comfortable with. Also, don't forget to leave your questions and comments in the live chat box during the session. We will choose top questions or comments to present gifts. Winners of the event will be announced in KNDA official Facebook and Instagram account on October 14th. We will now start the third session on Northeast Asian Economic Cooperation and Rsep, looking to a promising future. Ambassador Kim Young-moo, Director General of the Department of Asian and Pacific Studies at Korea National Diplomatic Academy, will moderate this session. Let me pass the microphone over to Ambassador Kim.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm moderator of the third session of the 2021 Northeast Asia Peace and Cooperation Forum. As introduced, I am Kim Young-moo of the Korea National Diplomatic Academy. In the first and second session yesterday, we carried out in-depth discussions regarding peace and cooperation in Northeast Asia and also disaster management and response in Northeast Asia. Today, we will move our discussion to the economic realm, and we will be discussing the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which was signed and is now awaiting to take effect. And with your understanding, I will refer to the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership as Rsep to save time. In this discussion today, we have invited experts from Korea, China, Japan, and Singapore. Allow me to introduce our panelists here sitting beside me and representing Korea. We are joined by Dr. Kim Yang-hee, Director General of the Department of International Economy, Trade, and Development Studies at the Korea National Diplomatic Academy. Next, we are joined by Professor Hong Min, Associate Professor at the School of International Economics at China Foreign Affairs University. Hello and good morning to you. And next we are joined by Professor Pasa Xie, who is with the School of Law at Singapore Management University. Hello, Dr. Xie. Last but not least, we are joined by Professor Shinoda Kunihiko of Japan National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies. Can you hear us? Hello and good morning to you. Before we begin our discussion, let me remind our panelists on how we will proceed. In this third session, our panelists will not have individual interventions. I will ask our panelists questions, and our panelists will offer their answers. I have three questions for our panelists. The first question pertains to the significance and meaning of the signing of Rcep, with a particular focus on the meaning it has for regional economic integration. And I would ask our panelists to talk about the significance of Rcep, particularly for each of the countries that they represent. And the second question pertains to the content of Rcep. As other FTAs, Rcep covers trade in goods, service investments, and trade rules. I would like to hear what our panelists think of the content of Rcep, how you would assess the agreement. And I would also like to ask our panelists to talk about the strengths and weaknesses of Rcep. And the last question is regarding the way forward for Rcep. I think we can cover many issues with this question. As you know, during the last part of the negotiations, India withdrew from the negotiations, so we can talk about whether enlarging the membership for Rcep is the way forward. And I would also like to ask our panelists to comment on how Rcep can set up or establish relations with CPTPP, which took effect in 2018. And also I would like to ask for any proposals, suggestions, and ideas on how you believe believe Rsep can develop further in the future. As you can see, we have a lot to cover, and this is a technical topic, but we only have an hour and 40 minutes. So without further ado, I would like to begin our discussion. The first question is this. As I mentioned earlier, I would like to ask our panelists about the significance and meaning of the signing of Rsep, especially with regard to the East Asia Regional Economic Integration. As you know, in 1989, we had APEC, and recently the CPTPP was signed, and as you know, recently Rsep was signed as well. So I would like to know what you think the significance of Rsep is against the backdrop of a regional economic integration, and also you each represent your own country in a way. So I would like to ask you the implication of Rsep in each of your respective countries. I will be giving each of our panelists 6 minutes to offer their comments, and I would like to ask that you stay within your time limit. And of course, during those 6 minutes, if you have any presentation slides that you wish to share, please pull them up on the screen. We will proceed in alphabetical order, starting with Professor Min, followed by Professor Xie, followed by Professor Kim, and then followed by Professor Shinoda, in that order. And for your information, Professor Xie will start the second question, and the other professors will follow in the order that I mentioned, and Professor Kim Yang-yi will answer the third question first, and then we will proceed in alphabetical order. So I would like to invite Professor Min. If you could please respond to the first question, I give you the floor.
허민 교수님.
Professor Min. Professor Ho.
Thank you.
네.
Could you hear me now?
네, 잘 들립니다. 네, 교수님.
Yes, we can hear you. Can you please answer the
I
first
can
question?
hear you very clearly.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation of the forum. As a young researcher, it's a good learning opportunity for me to discuss with distinguished guests and panelists, and further my study of East Asia economic integration. First of all, I wanted to discuss about the meaning of the Rsep from two perspectives. First of all, from the perspective of global regionalization development history, like Ambassador Kim just described, and actually compared with EU in Europe and NAFTA, now USCMA in North America. The institutional development of regional economic integration in East Asia has begun rather late, since 1990s of EPAC, with the aim of FTA-AP. Well, it's hard to achieve agreement in over 20 economies, so EPAC members tend to voluntary liberalization, so which form the two FTA tracks, to my understanding. So one is a Trans-Pacific or Asia-Pacific track, being through actually starting from P5 to P3, P4 to TPP 12 to CPTPP 11. And then finally took effect at the end of the 2018. So CPTPP now is currently the highest standard trade agreement in the world so far. And another track is the East Asia track, which based on 10+6 mechanism with ASEAN as a hub and ASEAN centrality. So based on 10+6 and eventually signed at the end of 2020, Rsep and right now is currently the trade agreement with the largest population and economic scale in the world, with 30% of the world population and close to 1/3 of the world GDP and the world total trade volume. So from this perspective, I think the signing of the Rsep sent a clear signal, especially at the present, being faced with the COVID-19 trade protectionism, and also the sluggish world economy. The signing of the Rsep sent a clear signal to the world that East Asian countries adhere to open regional economic integration. We choose to open up rather than protectionism, cooperation rather than confrontation. So I inject new impetus into the regional and world economic development and also the recovery after the epidemic. Second, from the perspective of regional economic integration, because we have a lot of institutional arrangements in this East Asia region. We have a lot of FTAs, have like spaghetti bowl effect. Rsep actually, which covers a wider range of the areas, could integrate existing cooperation mechanisms and optimize the regional economic governance mechanisms. And also in terms of the rules, the Rsep agreement has 20 chapters, including not only tradition issues, but also the new issues such as e-commerce, intellectual property, which shows the higher level of the integration of economic integration, and also the requirements is higher than those of previous FTAs in this region. So from this perspective, I think Rsep will significantly enhance the level of the regional economic integration in East Asia, especially on promoting the integration of regional industrial supply and value chains. And from the China's perspective, I think to be brief, I think have 5 implications. Rsep countries are important trading partners of China. So in 2020, China's trade with Rsep countries accounted for 31% of its total trade, and ASEAN overtook Europe and the United States to become the largest trading partner. Japan ranked in the 4th place, and South Korea the 5th place, and also Australia 8th place. So if Rsep takes full effect, 1/3 of the China's foreign trade will be tax-free. So first, I think from the perspective of economic integration, the most important highlight from the perspective of China is a tariff in a reduction arrangement or trade agreement between China and Japan under the Rsep framework, because among the Rsep countries, China already has FTAs with ASEAN, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, but Japan. Second, the existing bilateral FTAs, just I mentioned, are all kind of low-leveled. So with under the Rsep framework, it will be upgraded at the degree of liberalization of some products will be further enhanced because of Rsep. And after the Rsep takes effect, about 86% to 90% of trade in goods will eventually be tariff-free, with a greater proportion of tax-free trade and higher degree of liberalization. Third, so the rules of origin and other provisions of Rsep rules will further promote China's participation in the production, supply chain, and the value chain in East Asia. And fourth, to some extent, Rsep will hedge the negative impact brought by the CPTPP entry into force and also Sino-US trade friction to China. And the fifth, I think, it's also one part of China's strategy now called new development paradigm. We call it dual circulation. The core is that outside to be open up to the outside world, and to inside to continue the domestic reform, benchmarking the higher standard of the international rules. So that's all. Thank you.
네, 허민 교수님 감사합니다.
Thank you very much, Professor Min. She gave us a comment on how this is the world's largest trade agreement, accounting 30% of the global GDP. And she also elaborated on China's perspective of Rsep. And one of the most notable features of Rsep is that it has essentially allowed a free trade zone to be formed between China and Japan. And she mentioned China had FTAs with other countries, with the exception of Japan. I'm sure that our professor from have comments too. Professor Xie?
Well, thank you very much. Well, thank you, Ambassador Kim, for your invitation and for your very kind introduction. So let me provide some thoughts about the Rsep and New Asian regionalism, particularly from Singapore and ASEAN perspective. First, let me provide the contextual background of the Rsep. Columbia Law Professor Bhagwati coined the term the first regionalism that referred to trade initiative in the 1960s. By that time, most trade initiatives failed because of political reasons. And in the 1980s, the Professor Bhagwati also referred these new FTA that occurred in the second regionalism. That's what he called. And in this era, we witnessed the economic growth of four Asian tigers, including South Korea, and the rise of China. And as Ambassador Kim alluded to, ASEAN and APEC were the most important trade initiative in the era. I argue that we are now in the third regionalism, which has developed in tandem with the Doha Round since the 2000s. So there are three important characteristics of the third regionalism. The first, we now have more and more FTA between developing countries, known as South-South FTA, which account for 75% of the FTA worldwide, such as ASEAN FTA. We also now have more mega FTA. So Professor He mentioned APEC. APEC has discussed the proposals for FTAAP, Free Trade Area of the Asia Pacific, since 2010. So the purpose of the FTAAP is to connect 21 APEC economies. So now we have CPTPP, which was concluded in 2018, and the Rsep, which was signed in 2020, and the CPTPP and Rsep are the most feasible pathway to the FTAAP. And the third important characteristic is the comprehensiveness FTA. So most FTA now have both a WTO plus and extra obligations. So for instance, the dichotomy between FTA and bilateral investment treaties or agreement become blurred because most FTA now have a very sophisticated investment chapters. And now let me address Rsep. Why Rsep is important for regional economic integration. So that's the question posed by Ambassador Kim. A very important and simple answer to the question is this. Rsep is the largest FTA by economic scale, which account for 30% of global GDP. And here, I produced a ranking of major FTA based on their GDP. Rsep is number one, followed by USMCA, and then EU, CPTPP, as well as other South-South FTA, such as ASEAN, Mercosur, and Pacific Alliance. So from this ranking, we know that the economic scale of the Rsep is comparable to that of the EU 27 countries and CPTPP combined. So that's why Rsep is significant. So Rsep includes 15 parties, such as China and 10 ASEAN countries, and India decided not to join in 2019. And Rsep also consolidated 4 ASEAN plus 1 FTA, making the Rsep ASEAN plus structure. So the 4 ASEAN plus 1 FTA include ASEAN Australia New Zealand FTA, ASEAN China FTA, ASEAN Korea FTA, as well as ASEAN Japan FTA. Why Rsep is important? One reason is that one reason is the very low usage of ASEAN plus 1 FTA. For example, only 2.3% of importers actually use ASEAN-Japan FTA. So we hope the Rsep will change the problem, will remedy the problem, and further consolidate the regional supply chain in the region. I also wish to clarify some myths associated with the Rsep. Western media and usually portray Rsep as a China-led FTA. So many of my colleagues in ASEAN wanted to emphasize that Rsep is actually led by ASEAN. So since the inception of the third regionalism, China and Japan have various proposals for regional integration. China preferred the ASEAN +1 proposal known as EAFTA, whereas Japan prefers CEPA, which is based on ASEAN +6 countries, including Australia, New Zealand, India as additional members. In order to avoid being marginalized, ASEAN proposed ASEAN framework for the Rsep in 2011 and proclaimed that the Rsep should be the ASEAN-led process. And in 2012, all the Rsep members issued a guiding principle and objective for the Rsep. And they all emphasize the concept of ASEAN centrality in regional framework. And that's why Rsep is very critical to ASEAN. And as Ambassador Kim alluded to, the negotiations began in 2013. And we concluded the ASEAN negotiation in 2019 and signed the agreement in 2020. So the final issue I want to address regarding this question is the future of the Rsep. Will the Rsep further consolidate existing FTA or lead to more serious trade fragmentation problem? Professor He mentioned that one important benefit of the Rsep is to fill the FTA gap. For instance, Japan currently does not have FTA with Japan, Korea, New Zealand. So Rsep fill the gap. Rsep also form the benchmark for CJK FTA negotiation, so the FTA between China, Japan, and Korea. But we should also know that Rsep does not follow the clean slate model. In other words, the Rsep does not supersede current FTA or BIT. In other words, the Rsep will coexist with current trade and investment agreement. So it creates opportunities and problems from Singapore perspective. For instance, if I'm based in Singapore, I'm a company, I want to export goods to Japan, I have 4 options: Singapore-Japan FTA, ASEAN-Japan FTA, which includes Singapore, CPTPP, and Rsep. And all of the 4 FTA have different tariff rules and different rate for the tariff liberalization. Another important issue is dispute settlement mechanism. If I am a company, I want to sue Japan, I want to bring a complaint against Japan. I have 4 options. And how could an SME understand a very complicated issue involving 4 different complicated FTA? So that is a challenge. So I would argue that Rsep will alleviate the trade fragmentation problem, or commonly known as noodle bowl syndrome or spaghetti bowl syndrome, on a de facto basis rather than on a de jure basis. In other words, if Rsep does provide a better deal, the companies and investors will choose Rsep over existing bilateral agreement. So that's my answer to Ambassador Kim's question. Thank you.
네, 시 교수님 감사합니다.
Thank you very much, Professor Xie. You shared with us ASEAN's perspective regarding Rsep, and I think that's what you were trying to explain. So you mentioned that South-South FTA accounts for 75% of global FTA. This is the first time I heard that. That is quite a substantial amount. And you talked about the noodle bowl effect and spaghetti bowl effect. And Rsep will be able to sort of consolidate the FTAs in the region and alleviate the noodle bowl effect. And you also mentioned that from Japan's perspective, because Japan didn't have a lot of bilateral BTAs, especially with New Zealand, Korea, and China, because they're part of Rsep, it creates that effect of signing a bilateral effect with these countries. And Professor Hall talked about China's perspective, saying how that it's like they have a new China-Japan FTA. And so from Japan's perspective, they have an FTA with not only China, but Korea and also New Zealand. And so they didn't have bilateral FTAs with these countries, but now with the Rsep, they can enjoy the benefits of these bilateral FTAs. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of economic benefit to Japan in this aspect. And Professor Sie, one thing that I would like to highlight is that you were saying it's led by ASEAN. So Rcep is led by ASEAN, and I fully agree with what you say. As a negotiator that took part in the Rcep negotiations, I watched the whole process, and from the very beginning, of course, I was part of the negotiations, and one thing I realized was that this was being led by ASEAN. So I think that it was a process where we made improvements on the ASEAN Plus One FTA, and I think that is what you also highlighted in your remarks, Professor Sie. A lot of people think that CPTPP took effect in 2018, and then Rsep was signed in 2020. So people think that CPTPP, of course, U.S. left CPTPP, but CPTPP is led by the United States and Rsep is led by China. So they think CPTPP and Rsep sort of reflect the rivalry between China and U.S., and that's the perception. But I think Professor Sie is clearly pointed out that is not the case. Rsep is not a regional trade bloc led by China, but it is actually a trade initiative led by ASEAN countries. And I would also like to touch upon this point with Professor Hall later on, and I will give her an extra additional question because I want to ask her, is this, led by ASEAN or led by China? What does she think? So I'll ask you that question later on. But we still have to hear from two speakers regarding the first question, so let us proceed. So next is Professor Kim Yang-hee.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Kim Yang-hee of KNDA. Some of my comments overlap with the previous speakers, but I would like to offer my comments anyway because I believe they are important points, and I believe that it also highlights that we have a consensus on these points. First of all, I want to talk about the significance of Rcep as a regional trade agreement. It is the world's largest trade agreement, so I think that it is a unique regional economic integration from a quantitative but also a qualitative perspective. Professors talked about how Rcep consolidates 4 FTAs, but from Korea's perspective, Rcep consolidates 5 existing FTAs. And one other notable point is that the worldwide manufacturing champions are encompassed in Rcep. China, Japan, and Korea are very strong manufacturing powerhouses, and they are part of Rcep. And this is one of the biggest strengths of Rcep in my mind. And one of the most unique features of Rcep is that unlike CPTPP, Rcep is a natural trading bloc. It's an economic integration of the most prosperous East Asian region in the world, and it is a naturally sort of built trading bloc. I think that is what separates Rcep from CPTPP. So I believe that market integration was happening organically and naturally, and this sort of naturally evolved into Rcep.
From Korea's perspective, Rsep has a great significance. And now let me elaborate on what the meaning for Korea is. First is that Rsep is the first mega FTA. I think that when it comes to mega FTAs, Japan overtook Korea. Korea has many FTAs, but not many mega FTAs. So from Korea's perspective, Rsep is the first mega FTA. So in that sense, joining Rsep for Korea means that it is integrated into a vast regional market. And as you know, due to the COVID-19 crisis, the global economy has shrunk. And joining Rsep at this time, I think, offers great potential for the Korean economy. And secondly, Rsep is a de facto Korea-Japan FTA, and of course, this comes with advantages and disadvantages. As you know, Seoul and Tokyo suspended the FTA negotiations in 2004, largely due to the highly competitive relationship between the industries of the two economies. For instance, when it comes to automobiles and other products, the two countries have a highly competitive relationship, and the situation remains almost unchanged today. And so through Rsep, Korea has actually signed a de facto FTA with Japan through Rsep. It also means that through Rsep, Korea will be able to enjoy reduced prices of intermediate and capital goods that Korea needs to import from Japan for its own exports. And also, Korea has enjoyed a comparative advantage in the Chinese market over Japan. And however, due to Rsep, Korea's comparative advantage in the Chinese market will diminish. So this may be one of the disadvantages of Rsep being a de facto Korea-Japan FTA. And for Korea, ASEAN can become a closer market, and this falls in line with the current government's new Southern policy. Rsep offers an opportunity for Korea to forge closer relations with ASEAN countries. So Rsep falls in line with the new Southern policy, and it could serve as a driving engine to further the new Southern policy. But I would like to mention that it will not be easy to form a relationship with ASEAN because ASEAN countries have very strong existing ties with China and Japan. And ASEAN countries may differentiate Korea from China and Japan. And having to forge better, stronger relations with ASEAN countries against this backdrop will prove to be an important challenge for Korea. Actually, can I add one more thing? And the moderator talked about whether Rsep was led by ASEAN or led by China. And I would also like to offer my comments on this topic later on. Thank you very much, Dr. Kim Yang-hee. She talked about the implications for Rsep for Korea, and she touched upon how it encompasses manufacturing powerhouses of the world. And she also pointed out how Rsep was sort of evolved from a naturally built value chain and a naturally built economic bloc.
And she also talked about how Rsep is a de facto FTA with China and Japan. Korea has a pre-existing FTA with China, but it did not have an FTA with Japan. And Korea, therefore, enjoyed an advantage over Japan in the Chinese market. But she talked about how that advantage may be diminished or may be at risk due to Rsep. That also encompasses Japan. So I thought that was an interesting point from the Korean perspective. Lastly, I would like to invite Professor Shinoda, but before we do, I have an additional question for him. So I think there's already a lot of questions regarding Japan, even though you haven't began your presentation. And Professor Hall talked about how Rsep was like China's first FTA with Japan. And from Japan's perspective, they have now new FTAs with China and New Zealand, countries that they did not have FTAs with before. And Professor Kim just talked about how Rsep created a situation where Korea's competitiveness might go down a little bit. And so it seems that there's a lot of benefits to Japan because of Rsep. And if I could add one more point, we talked about mega FTAs, and Professor Kim mentioned that Rsep is the first mega FTA that Korea is joining, and how Japan is actually very much a leader in this area. Japan is already part of CPTPP. Japan is part of Rcep. You have the Japan-EU FTA. So it seems that Japan is taking part in mega FTAs that covers all continents. So it is a pillar in these mega FTAs. And so how does Japan view its position in these mega FTAs? If you could talk about these points. So Professor Shinoda, if you are ready, we would like to ask you to share with us your thoughts.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am Kunihiko Shinoda of the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies. And it is a great honor for me to participate in the Northeast Asia Peace and Cooperation Forum 2021. And I was involved in the Rsep negotiations in the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry from 2017 to 2019. And first of all, I'd like to touch upon significance of the Rsep. So I'd like to share my presentation material with you just a moment. Can you see my presentation document on the screen? Okay, thank you very much. And Rsep is an economic partnership agreement for a region that accounts for about 30% of the world's GDP, total trade, and population, and is a huge regional economic integration that surpasses NAFTA, EU, and CPTPP in these indicators. And since the 1980s, East Asia, led by ASEAN, has seen the expansion of industrial supply chains due to the growth of foreign direct investment. And de facto regional economic integration has taken precedence. To support this trend, the de jure regional economic integration has also developed, including the AFTA, ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, the ASEAN Plus One FTA, and the Rsep, which is a network of these FTAs. And Rsep will contribute to further streamlining and revitalizing the region's expansive supply chain and a unified set of trade rules. The Rsep also establishes free and fair economic rules in the region by regulating a wide range of areas, such as intellectual property and electronic commerce among various countries at different stages of development and with different systems. As more and more countries take protectionist measures in the midst of the US-China confrontation and pandemic, the realization of the Rsep led by ASEAN will be of great significance in promoting the liberalization and facilitation of trade and investment in the region. The trade between Japan and Rsep participating countries accounts for about 50% of Japan's trade with the rest of the world. So concluding, the Rsep will have significant economic benefits for Japan. In particular, in relation to China and Korea, Japan has concluded its first FTA with these countries through Rsep. And trade with both countries accounts for 27% of Japan's trade with the rest of the world. And this brings the share of FTA signatory and effective partners in Japan's trade value to about 80%. And as for the percentage of duty-free products to Japan, China's share has risen from 8% to 86%, and Korea's from 19% to 92%, showing the greatest benefits of trade liberalization. And new effects of tariff elimination and reaction are expected for, firstly, exports to ASEAN of products assembled in Japan from materials originating in China and Korea. And the second, exports to ASEAN of products assembled from materials originating in Japan by Japanese companies operating in China and Korea. And in the future, it is necessary to accelerate negotiations to realize a comprehensive and high-quality CJK FTA with unique value and while building on Rsep. And Rsep is also beneficial to ASEAN as it established a framework for ASEAN-centered broad-based economic integration underpinned by the ASEAN Plus One FTAs that ASEAN has built with each of the ASEAN dialogue countries. So we'd like to pay respect for the ASEAN centrality in formulating mega FTA centered on ASEAN. And the Rsep agreement improves the level of liberalization and rules compared to the existing ASEAN Plus One FTA, and also includes special considerations for ASEAN's least developing countries in such areas as the transitional measures for liberalization and redevelopment. And thank you very much.
네, 신호다 교수님 감사합니다.
So thank you very much, Professor Shinoda. I think you shared a very interesting statistics with us. So China, Korea, New Zealand, these are countries that Japan is signing a new FTA with through Rsep. And so I think you've also shown us that China and Japan through Rsep can also export products to these countries. And so if you look at China, if they didn't have Rsep, they only had 8% of products that they could export that was duty-free, but now it increases to 86%. So from China's perspective. And then from Korea's perspective, when they didn't have Rsep, only 19% of items could be exported to Japan duty-free. But now with the Rsep in place, it has increased to 92%. So it seems that a majority of the items or products could be exported to Japan duty-free. So I think you pointed out how mutually benefiting Rsep is. And you also talked about the importance of CJK FTA. And I think with CJK FTA, Professor Hall would also have some thoughts to share as well. And Professor Shinoda, also one of the things that you mentioned, it seems that with the signing of Rsep,
We talk about the regional value chain and also RVC. So the de facto economic integration, it seems that through Rcep, under the leadership of ASEAN, has now transitioned to a de jure economic integration. And I think this is something that Professor Kim also talked about. It is in line with what she said. So we just heard from the four panelists about the meaning of Rcep and the perspective of Rcep from their own region, from their own countries. And I think we will move on to the second question.
Here is the second question. It seems that there are mixed reviews regarding the Rcep agreement text. When it was announced that Rcep was signed, we saw many media outlets and other countries not part of Rcep form a general consensus that Rcep is not a high-level comprehensive FTA. Rcep is like other FTAs. It contains chapters on trade and service and goods and investment and trade rules. So I would like to ask our panelists their thoughts on the content of Rcep. What is missing from this agreement? And as I mentioned earlier, I would also like to ask our panelists what they think the strengths and weaknesses of Rcep are. We will begin with Professor Xie. He will be followed by Professor Kim Yang-hee, and then we will hear from Professor Shinoda and Professor Ho-min. So, Professor Xie, you can go first.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Kim. With respect to the second question, and I will first address an important issue that Ambassador Kim alluded to. So a lot of people compare Rcep to CPTPP and argue that Rcep is not as sophisticated, as high level as CPTPP, so it's a shallow FTA, not very useful. And I disagree with this argument. And it's true that if we compare the two FTA, CPTPP is more comprehensive because Rcep has 20 chapters, CPTPP has 30 chapters. And more importantly, if you compare the two FTA, it's very easy to notice that major CPTPP areas are not included in the Rcep. And these areas include provisions on state-owned enterprises, labor, environment protection, anti-corruption issues. So these are so-called value-based provisions from the European perspective, as well as investor-state dispute settlement, ISDS. And I would argue that it's true that Rcep is not as high level as CPTPP, but the strength of the Rcep is that it actually provides an opportunity for developing countries to accede to mega FTA. And the Rcep is a good opportunity for them, particularly because Rcep focuses on development and special and differential treatment, SDT, which is key to developing countries. So now let me move on to the specific content and the text of the Rcep. First, tariff rules. Tariff liberalization is probably the most important issue when we talk about FTA. The rate of tariff liberalization under ASEAN Plus One FTA range from 92 to 95%, and Rcep is no exception. So Rcep is largely in line with current ASEAN Plus One FTA. However, we should note that Rcep includes significant exclusion and extended phase-in periods. For example, duties will remain in place for 39% of ASEAN's food exports. And Japan is also a very interesting case because Japan excluded a lot of agricultural product from liberalization, such as beef, dairy, sugar, pork, rice, wheat. So it's not as comprehensive as CPTPP in terms of tariff liberalization on agricultural goods. And more importantly, if we look at tariff commitment, we should know that Rsep include 20-year phase-in period for many products. So in ASEAN Plus One FTA, they usually include longer phase-in periods for so-called CLMV country, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam. But under the ASEAN, almost every country has very long phase-in periods for quite a lot of products. For example, a lot of auto companies have great hope for the Rsep because they want to export cars to the Chinese market. But if we look at China's commitment, China entered U for imported vehicles. In other words, China will continue and remain its 25% tariff on imported vehicles. So Rsep will not change that. For auto parts, China's tariff on auto parts will only reach zero in the 16th year. So the impact will not be seen immediately. However, on the other hand, I would also argue that for one important issue, that will be very significant. That is the harmonization of rules of origin. Most FTA follow CTC change in tariff classification and RVC regional value content rule. And Rsep also follow these two important rules and set the RVC threshold at 40%. In other words, you can still use materials from non-Rsep country up to 60%. And this is very liberal compared to so-called Western FTA, such as USMCA. So for the 40% rule, you can use any material from any Rsep country. And this is very significant. It will largely consolidate the regional supply chain. And more importantly, from the trade facilitation perspective, this is very important because currently different ASEAN FTA have different certificate of origin. For example, the internal ASEAN FTA, known as ATICA, use Form D, and that is the certificate of origin. And for the ASEAN Korea FTA, exporters have to use Form AK to prove rules of origin. So now Rsep require only one set of certificate of origin, and that can save a lot of problem for exporters. In terms of services, Rsep adopted a hybrid approach. 8 countries, Rsep members adopted a positive list for service schedules, whereas 7 countries, such as Korea, adopted a more progressive negative list approach. But for countries that adopted a positive list approach, that is a WTO approach, and they are required to switch to the more progressive negative list approach in 6 years. But more time will be accorded to Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar. Another very important issue is ISDS, and this is a very important issue to many lawyers concerning investment protection. So there is a trend that find the countries and scholars find ISDS very annoying. One of the reasons is that ISDS create so-called regulatory chill because governments are very concerned about their public policy measures because they may be sued by multinational companies. So there's a new trend now. If we look at new agreements such as ASEAN-Hong Kong Investment Agreement and UK-Japan FTA, and these agreements do not have ISDS. So Rsep follow the trend, and under the work program, the Rsep parties will consider these issues in 2 years after Rsep become effective. And this is a drastic change from negotiations perspective, because in 2015, Rsep members actually plan to include ISDS. The fundamental change occurred in 2017 when New Zealand government decided not to include any ISDS in a free trade agreement. So the Rsep has no ISDS, but it doesn't mean that you have no mechanism to solve investor-state disputes, because the investor can still use state-to-state dispute settlement mechanism, and the investor can also continue to use current ISDS under existing ASEAN +1 FTA. So in terms of a government procurement, Rsep is also very important, because now only 5 Rsep members are parties to the WTO agreement on government procurement. And Rsep include rules on transparency and cooperation in terms of public procurement rules. But we should also know that Rsep does not include government procurement commitment. And so that is the major weakness. And also government procurement chapter is not subject to dispute settlement mechanism. Digital trade is another very important issue because of COVID-19, the lockdown measures or safe distancing rules, more people like to shop online. So there is a 70% increase in e-commerce orders in the Asia Pacific. And Rsep addressed 2 important rules in e-commerce: data, the prohibition of data localization and barriers to the cross-border transfer of data. So it just looked like TPP. But if we look closely, we will find out Rsep actually create vast policy space by including self-judging exception. In other words, based on legitimate public policy objective or essential security interests, the government can depart from the rules. And the government can decide whether or not the public policy objective is legitimate, or whether the security interests are essential. Another important issues relate to dispute settlement mechanism. So WTO and Rsep both have dispute settlement mechanism, but under WTO law, WTO jurisdiction will not be affected by other FTAs such as Rsep. But the situation can be even more complicated, because within Rsep, there are actually many trade and investment agreement, and they all have dispute settlement mechanisms. Under international law, we have a very important rule known as later in time rule, meaning that the subsequent agreement will prevail over the previous rule. But in practice, it doesn't work. The reason is that all the agreements have a different scope of their dispute settlement mechanism, and they all have different exceptions. And another important issue is the establishment of Rsf Secretariat, and this is in the Rcep text. And this will be a milestone in new Asian regionalism. So compared with the TPP, which only plan to establish a commission without a standing secretariat. So, and after Rcep's entry into force requires 6 of ASEAN members and 3 of ASEAN +1 partners. As of now, we have 4 countries that have ratified the Rcep. So we still need other members to ratify in order for the Rcep to become effective. And the Rcep in the future will be open for accession by any state or separate custom territory. So this is very important to realize the APEC's goal of FTAAP. So I include additional analysis regarding the rules and Rcep in my new book, but I should stop here. Well, thank you very much.
네, 시혜 교수님 상세한 설명.
So thank you very much for that very detailed explanation. So one thing I would like to highlight is that in the case of Rcep, some people say that it is not comprehensive enough and that the level of liberalization is low. And this has been pointed out as the limitations. But like you mentioned, I think it provided opportunity for more developing countries to take part in this trade agreements. So I think that is a positive aspect of Rsep, and I agree with what you said. As you mentioned, for e-commerce,
이 부분에 대해서는 지금 WTO의
in WTO, they don't have any rules regarding e-commerce. And so in all FTAs, e-commerce is regulated by two parties.
15개국의
So with Rsep, we now have e-commerce rules that applies to 15 countries. So I think this is quite meaningful in this age of digitalization. And the free movement of data across borders. And as you mentioned, with regard to data localization, there is prohibition. So I think that having this single sort of integrated rule for all the countries in Rsep is quite meaningful. So in that aspect, I think you cannot say that Rsep is a non-comprehensive, low-level trade agreement. I don't think that is right. So I really agree with what you say. Because we're running out of time, I'm going to turn the floor to Professor Kim. So I gave each speaker 6 minutes. So if you could maybe speak only for 5 minutes, that would be appreciated.
Thank you very much, Professor Shea. I think that we are completely on the same page. I would like to thank you for your detailed comments, and I would like to compliment your comments. In Korea, many people compare Rsep with CPTPP, and they say that Rsep is not comprehensive. But I think we need to separate an ideal situation with reality. I think ideally, CPTPP is the more comprehensive agreement, but we need to think about the purpose of these trade agreements and who they serve. This is what I would like to highlight. Of course, a high-level agreement is nice, but it doesn't solve everything. I think at the very least, I think trade agreements need to serve the vulnerable in the region, in the country. It needs to touch upon issues of inequality. Trade agreements need to be able to serve the purpose of bettering the quality of life for all people. Of course, compared to CPTPP, Rsep is of a lower level. But when compared to ASEAN Plus One FTAs, generally speaking, I think that Rsep is better. But what is disappointing is that Korea, China, Japan did not make enough concessions when it comes to trade in goods. I think we could have had a better deal in terms of trading goods. I think one of the most notable achievements of Rsep is the integrated rules of origin. If you look at the service chapter and the investment chapter, there were many achievements. In the case of China, for the first time, China added 22 to the 100 liberalization sectors committed in the WTO, and it went beyond WTO commitments in 37 areas. I think this is a notable achievement. And one of the notable features or significant feature of Rsep, I think, is the RVC. Especially with Rsep, there is a strong presence of China in the RVC. I believe that the negotiations were led by ASEAN, but I think that when it comes to RVC, China leads in Rsep. And the strengths and weaknesses of Rsep is what I would like to talk about next. I think the RVC of Rsep is a naturally originating RVC. This naturally originating RVC was integrated institutionally, and I believe that in that sense, Rsep will enhance the efficiency of RVC in the region. But it also has a weakness.
And that weakness is the strong presence of China. So I believe that Korea and other countries might have to deal with an excessively strong presence of China in the RVC. And I think this is something that China needs to be aware of and keep note of. And Rsep centers around RVC, but the RVC of Rsep is not closed. The RVC of Rsep is closely interconnected, and this is something that we need to keep in mind. So, the ROO of Rsep, I believe the 40% rule of RCV within Rsep is a very positive feature. So Rsep needs to be more open, and it needs to become a mechanism that connects Rsep countries to other markets and other trading blocks. So openness needs to continue to be a key principle for Rsep. One of the key risks of Rsep, or the key weakness of Rsep, is, I believe, also its strength. I think Rsep is very unique, is the economic integration between strategic competitors. I think this is its strength and its weakness. Rsep was negotiated for 8 years, and it took that long because this is an agreement between strategic competitors. For instance, if you look at China and Japan, they are competitive, and Japan and Australia, or rather China and Australia, have experienced their own conflict. And I think that in the history of economic integration, Rsep is unprecedented in that it encompasses all these strategic competitors. And what is most encouraging is that China and Japan have already ratified Rsep, and this is one of the most welcome piece of news, and I think this is a very positive sign for the future of Rsep. So one of the biggest challenges for Rsep, I believe, will be to alleviate conflict between the strategic competitors within the Rsep framework. That will be the biggest potential challenge for Rsep. And one of the last weaknesses that can be turned into a strength is the disparity between the member countries. If you look at the income level, the technology level, there is a great disparity among Rsep countries. So this can be a weakness, but at the same time, it can be turned into a strength. It took 8 years, but Rsep has been signed. And the reason why it took so long is also because of the different levels of income and technology among the countries. And if you look at each of the countries, each have different relations and position in terms of security and politics. The fact that we have overcome all of this and signed the Rsep, I think, is something that we need to be happy about. Professor Xie and Professor Kim touched upon the level of Rsep and the scope of Rsep. Both professors mentioned how it embraces developing countries. They noticed or touched upon how Rsep deals with how developing countries have largely been left out in trade agreements. When I worked earlier, we talked a lot about inclusiveness. So Rsep, the focus of Rsep was inclusiveness. And so the point was to have a lower level free trade agreement that had a larger inclusiveness that could encompass more developing countries. And the goal was to build upon a lower level deal and build it gradually into a higher level while encompassing developing countries. Professor Kim also mentioned how Rsep is a trade deal that brings together strategic competitors in the global community. And because we are focused on an economic topic, perhaps it is not appropriate to go so deep into these competitive relations, but it is true that China and Japan have a strategically competitive relationship, and Australia and China also had its disputes and conflicts. But the fact that all of this was overcome to sign Rsep, I think, leaves a good precedent in the history of economic integration, and it can prove to be a good precedent in this sense. And next, I would like to invite our professor from Japan.
Yeah, thank you, Ambassador Kim. And I'd like to pick up some important items of the market access and rulemaking. Just a moment. And regarding rules of origin, which differ among ASEAN plus one FTAs, Rcep stipulates uniform rules of origin. The Rcep also allows for flexibility in rules of origin, such as the accumulation of value added among multiple countries and the choice between regional value content criteria and changing tariff classification criteria. And some countries adopted a negative list in the area of trade in services, with other countries moving from the positive list to the negative list after a certain period of time. And in the investment chapter, the principle of granting national treatment and most favored nation, American treatment, at the pre-establishment stage was allowed based on the negative list. And the prohibition of performance requirement, such as technology transfer requirements and loyalty restriction, is included. And the ISDS provisions, on the other hand, are not included at this time. And discussions are to begin with in 2 years on the ISDS after the agreement enters into force. And in the Indo-Pacific region, which is becoming increasingly service-oriented and digitalized, Rcep has contributed to the establishment of a free and fair trade regime by establishing solid rules in areas such as e-commerce and intellectual property. In the area of the intellectual property, it provides for ex officio injunctions against counterfeit goods and authority to dispose of them, and malicious trademarks, etc. And in the area of the e-commerce, it provides for data free flow and prohibition of data localization requirements. And in the area of trade facilitation, numerical targets have been set, such as allowing goods to clear customs within 48 hours whenever possible, and less than 6 hours for express shipments. Now, I'd like to move on to the strengths and weakness of the Rcep. And as for the strengths, Rcep established free and fair economic rules in the region by stipulating a wide range of areas, such as intellectual property and electronic commerce, and served as a starting point for the participation of developing countries, such as ASEAN, in the future international rulemaking. And the unification of rules of origin within the region has eliminated the spaghetti ball effect of FTAs and made it possible for companies to reduce their administrative costs related to trade. And the Rsep ministerial meeting is held every year in principle, and the Rsf Secretariat and Rsep Joint Committee have been established to ensure the steady implementation of the agreement by the Rsep parties. And as for the weakness, the Rsep's tariff elimination rate is a lower level of liberalization compared to other mega FTAs such as the CPTPP and the Japan-EU EPA. And also, chapters such as environment, labor, state-owned enterprises, and regulatory coherence, which are stipulated in the TPP, are absent in the Rcep. Thank you very much.
네, 신호다 교수님.
So thank you very much, Professor Shinoda, for your presentation. So you talked about the strength of Rsep, and of course that I think is having unified rules of origin. And then for service and investment, ISDS is not included, but for some countries, they have adopted negative list, and for investment, all countries have adopted the negative list, and also we have the principle of granting national treatment and most favored nation treatment at the pre-establishment stage, and so I think that these have actually contributed to improving rules regarding investment. So last but not least, I would like to turn the floor to Professor Hall.
Thank you, Ambassador Kim. I think in terms of the rules, Professor Xie, Professor Kim, and Professor Shinoda has talked almost all the chapters. I wanted to add up two things. First of all, I think the freer trade, which comes to the chapters.
허 교수님 들리세요?
Professor Hall, can you hear us?
혹시 들리시나요? 화면이 지금 정지되어
Professor
있는데요.
Hall, can you hear us?
허민 교수님.
Professor Hall?
네, 지금 허민 교수님 발표 중에
Professor Hall was speaking, and I think we are experiencing technical difficulties.
허민 교수님께서 말씀하신 내용은 Rsep의 내용에 관한 부분.
She was going to comment about the contents of Rsep,
한국 측에서 보는 Rsep
and
장점이나 약점에
she
대해서
was going to share the strengths and weaknesses of Rsep as seen by China. We are having technical difficulties, and we do not have a lot of time, so we will move on and come back to her later. So we will move on to the third question. The third question of this session is the final question.
토론에 대한 결론 부분입니다.
And I think it wraps up our discussion today. We talked about the significance of Rsep and the content of Rsep. And now I would like to ask about the future direction of Rsep. Rsep was signed in 2020. It has yet to take effect, but it follows a trend that began with ASEAN +1, and it will evolve later on. So I think we agree that this is sort of an evolving process. So against that backdrop, I would like to talk about what is the future direction of Rsep, and I would also like our panelists for their advice or proposals regarding how we can further develop Rsep. I would like to give our panelists 2 to 3 minutes. I don't think I have time to give each of you 6 minutes, so please, I will give you 2 to 3 minutes, and Dr. Kim will begin answering the question, and she will be followed by Professor Shinoda, Professor Hall, and Professor Xie. With the relationship between Rsep and CPTPP, a lot of people think that the coexistence of these two trade agreements will lead to fragmentation. But I do not think that we need to be concerned because they are not two polar opposites. One simply is a higher level agreement. And I think that if we continue to upgrade Rsep to a higher level, we can alleviate those concerns. Based on my experience, if I were to propose a way forward, I would have to say that Rsep has a strength because it began from a natural trading block. So this is a opportunity. So we have to think about how we can maximize that advantage. At the same time, there is a geopolitical risk of Rsep. As I mentioned earlier, there is a great disparity in many dimensions among the member countries. Also, there are risks that comes with the fact that this is a trade agreement among many strategic competitors. So I think we need to maximize the geo-economic opportunities while trying to minimize the geopolitical risks. Also, we need to establish rules that can prevent an excessive representation of China in the RVC to promote equal growth. And we also need to continue to pursue open regionalism as well. And we also need to recognize the importance of China as a market. This means that member countries that compete in the Chinese market must remember that Chinese have to provide a level playing field for these players in their market. And even from China's perspective, because it wants to join CPTPP, domestically, this will be an important issue. So creating a level playing field in the Chinese market will serve Rcep members, but it will also be beneficial for China as it seeks to later join CPTPP, which is a higher level agreement. And we also need to further integrate the market in a more transparent way. So we need a more transparent and predictable integration. And in order for us to do that, we need to build a rules-based governance. And so in order to do that, we have to be clear in defining the roles and responsibility of Rsf Secretariat. And one of the key risks that can be turned into a strength is the disparity. If we manage this well, Rsep can become an arrangement like WTO. So one of the most notable features of Rsep, as I mentioned earlier, is the economic integration between the strategic competitors. And if managed well, it can serve as a very important economic integration model. In order for us to turn this weakness into strength, I think we need the region's collective intelligence and diplomatic capacity. Thank you very much. She talked about how we need to maximize geo-economic opportunities while minimizing geopolitical risks. I think that you have mentioned and highlighted this point. And you also talked about how we need to alleviate disparity and continue to pursue open regionalism. You also talked about how we need to prevent an over-excessive representation of China that could undermine a level playing field. You also touched upon how China's openness and China's efforts are needed in order to ensure a level playing field. Professor Hall, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Professor Hall, can you hear me? We had some technical difficulties, so I would like to go back to you. And I would like you to assess the Rsep content and also talk about the strengths and weaknesses of Rsep.
해주시기 바랍니다.
Thank you. Sorry for just now. I would like to continue about just now, and I was talking about the freer trade with tariff zero chapters. That's just Professor Xie Shinoda all mentioned. I think that's one perspective. Another one is not only the tariff, but also like the rules of origin and also customs and the trade facilitation, SPS, TPT. These issues in the test, all parties agree to establish unify the standards of the goods and the services in this domain. So I think all these two aspects come to this Asia Pacific region. I mean, in Rsep will form a free and unified market. That's very important in this region, especially once we are a free and unified market, then from economic review, the complementary advantage among the members will be further developed. The factor flow and resource allocation will be more free and efficient. And also the regional industrial chain, supply chain, and the value chain will be more stable, especially in this post-COVID era, and also the degree and of the integration and resilience will be correspondingly enhanced. And also the regional industrial layout will be more reasonable, and the coordinated and balanced development of economy will be correspondingly enhanced. That's one point I wanted to add. And another one for the new rules, I would like to say there is a big potential in regional e-commerce. So just like Professor Xie have mentioned that it will be 70% of growth in Asia Pacific in region about the e-commerce. Take China as an example. So China's cross-border e-commerce began in 2014, and the retail volume of cross-border e-commerce increased by more than 50% every year. So by the end of 2019, the total cross-border e-commerce B2C transaction volume was 170 billion RMB. And this only accounts for less than 1% of China's total trade volume. I think there is a lot of room, especially in this post-COVID era, to develop the e-commerce or have joint effort in this effort in this chapter or in this issue. And also talk about the strengths and the weakness. I also agree with just Ambassador Kim said, and the inclusiveness of the Rsep. I think this is the biggest strength of Rsep. It's not that high standard of free trade agreement, so it will be more suitable and attractive to developing countries. So compared with CPTPP, so just like Professor Xie said, Rsep doesn't include chapters such as state-owned enterprises, like investor-state dispute settlement provisions. So the developing countries would have less worry about the more freer, the negative shock, external shock to its domestic economy once joined the Rsep. So enjoy the welfare of the free trade, meanwhile promote domestic reform to some extent, as new issues such as e-commerce and the small and medium-sized enterprises are reflected in Rsep. So therefore, Rsep would be attractive to countries in even more wider, region, or Asia region, including like India, Pakistan, Mongolia, North Korea, and even like Central and Eastern European countries, Latin American countries, Pacific Island countries, as it will not be too much pressure for them to join in. But it is also the weakness of the Rsep. I mean, from the rules, just we talked, it's kind of lower level FTA rules. So it will face the problem of upgrading. So just like Professor Kim mentioned, there are a long transition period for the countries for zero tariff reductions for some products would last like 10 years, even 21 years, like decades more to achieve zero tariff. However, the world trade is developing rapidly, and some Rsep countries are already members of the CPTPP, which have entered into force. China also submitted its formal application to join the CPTPP on September 16 and began to promote domestic reforms, benchmarking the CPTPP to the highest standards. So Rsep may face the problem of upgrading even before the transition period is completed. And another thing I think is that also professors have mentioned about the procedure uncertainty to enter into force about the Rsep because of the Sino-US competition and uncertainties for Rsep to take effect because Australia and New Zealand, including South Korea and some ASEAN countries which are the members of CPTPP, will be probably the key countries affecting the entry into force of Rsep in the coming months. Thank you, Ambassador.
네, 허민 교수님 감사합니다. 역시
Thank you very much. She touched upon how Rsep has inclusiveness as its greatest strength. And one thing that was interesting to me was that because of this inclusiveness, Rsep may be attractive to other developing countries in the region, such as Pakistan, North Korea, Mongolia, and even India, although it withdrew from the negotiations in the latter stage. I think that that point was very significant and interesting. And relatedly, I have one more additional question for Professor He. There was a question in the chat room on YouTube. Let me relay that question. Recently, joining Rcep or CPTPP has become an issue of conflict between China and Taiwan. If Taiwan were to join Rcep or CPTPP, or if the U.S. were to encourage or support Taiwan to join either Rcep or CPTPP, it seems likely that Sino-U.S. conflict will grow. So CPTPP is not the subject at hand, but if Pakistan, North Korea, Mongolia are accepted to Rcep, would Taiwan be able to join Rcep? So that is the question for you.
허민 교수님.
Professor He?
Oh, that's a hard question for me. Tough one. For me, I think in this region, to join in this CPTPP, the regional economic integration with higher standard, it will be beneficial to China, including Taiwan as a part of China. So as China has already shown and submitted its formal application to join the CPTPP, I think from my personal perspective, and as a part of China, together to join the CPTPP will probably be the trend. I think we all join in this higher standard, open up free trade agreement from economic review. I think it will be beneficial to all, even to, other region. The other members in this region. That's my point. I will stop here.
네, 허민 교수님 감사합니다. 굉장히 tough question이라고 말씀하셨는데요.
You said that it was a very tough question,
저희가 이해를 할 수 있을 것 같습니다.
and we understand your point.
대만이 중국의 일부이다라는 원칙을 훼손하지 않는 이상.
So I believe you said that as long as Taiwan is a part of China, then it would be beneficial for other member countries for China and Taiwan to join. As when APEC was launched in 1994, China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong joined together, and so there is historical precedence. So for Korea, I think we would welcome North Korea joining Rsep. So I think this shows the potential of Rsep in contributing to peace, even peace in the Northeast Asian region. We do not have a lot of time left, so let's return to the third question. The third question was about the future direction of Rsep and any ideas and suggestions and proposals to that end. We have heard from Professor Kim Yang-hee already, so I would like to ask for the advice and proposals of other professors regarding the future direction of Rsep. So I can give each of our professors 1 minute for their response. Professor Shinoda?
Thank you, Ambassador Kim. And the Rsep with India's participation is important from the perspective of realizing a free and open Indo-Pacific and expanding and strengthening a supply chain between India and ASEAN, Northeast Asia, and the Pacific. If India's return to the Rsep is difficult in the short term, efforts should be made to involve India in the East Asian supply chain through industrial cooperation with India. And in the future, the possibility of a higher level of liberalization and new development, like the CPTPP, should be explored during the Rsep review negotiations. And Rsep signatory countries that meet the high standard of liberalization and rules should be considered joining the CPTPP. And in the short term, the domestic process should be accelerated in order to bring the Rsep into force by early January 2022, as stated in the joint statement of the ASEAN Plus 3 Economic Ministers meeting. And it is necessary to formulate strategies to improve the access of SMEs to global value chains. Based on such strategies, dissemination and awareness-raising activities should be promoted through economic organizations so that as many companies as possible can take advantage of Rsep after it comes into effect. I also hope that the Rsep will develop into a platform for dialogue and cooperation in the regional trade and economic fields in the future. For example, capacity building efforts should be promoted to ensure the implementation of the Rsep in some developing countries in ASEAN. And finally, countries should work together to further improve the quality of the agreement and bring it as close as possible to the standard of the liberalization and international rulemaking set by the CPTPP in the general review process scheduled to take place every 5 years after the agreement enters into force. Thank you very much.
네, 신호다 교수님 감사합니다. 우선 Rsep의 향후 발전 방향과 관련해서
Talked about the future direction of Rsep and also how Rsep can
create free and open trade. And you talked about the importance of India joining Rsep, and there's going to be a lot of general review negotiations, and we should use those opportunities to increase the level of Rsep. And you also talked about how we should use Rsep to help the developing countries. And you also mentioned that we should also try to upgrade Rsep so that it is more in line with the level that we see at CPTPP. And I think that your comments also actually answered some of the questions that we got online through the YouTube channel. So one of the questions, questions were asked, and Rsep should also cooperate with other trading blocks, and which sort of trading blocks should they cooperate with was one question. And you talked about how we should continue to work so that our level of Rsep is in line with CPTPP. And from my perspective, I think first of all, Rsep and CPTPP, there's a lot of countries that have actually joined both trade agreements. So you can not really say that there are two separate, different trading blocks. They're very close neighbors. If I could answer this question, I think that you have EU, USMCA, you do have other trading blocks, but I think that Rsep will have to work closely with CPTPP. And we are almost out of time. So Professor Hall, I would like to ask you a question. What do you think is the way to further develop Rsep? So what sort of advice would you give? Professor Hall?
Thank you, Ambassador. So, for the Rsep, I think both Rsep and CPTPP, first of all, uphold APEC's idea of open regionalism and welcome countries from both inside and outside the region to join in. So for an economic integration arrangement, the more members it has and the larger its scale, the greater its trade liberalization welfare will be. Therefore, so I think we, just like I said, because Rsep is more attractive or suitable for developing countries. So first of all, after the enter into force, to invite more countries will be first one, and the second one, of course, the upgrading. Just like I said, also one of the weakness of Rsep, and another thing I wanted to emphasize is that just like we talked before, under Rsep framework, one of the most important feature is to establish a free trade agreement among China, Japan, and South Korea at the regional level. So under this Rsep framework, further attempts can be made to promote the negotiation of CGT, FTA negotiation. I think to promote in the future. And to promote the industrial connection among China, Japan, and South Korea to optimize the construction of regional value chain under the Rsep framework. For example, just now, Professor Xie talked about the zero tariff in like the auto parts, the automobile and the machinery components of these chapters. So we will have more tariff, zero tariff chapters and tariff lies. So in this automobile and other machinery industries, we can build the regional value chain integration, and also agricultural products is also, because of the zero tariff free arrangements in the chapter. So we can have more cooperations in agricultural products, regional value chain. And then another feature is to further, I have emphasized that. Just first one, to promote the negotiation of CGT, FTA. Second one, to further promote regional supply and the value chains within East Asia. Thank you.
네, 허민 교수님 감사합니다. Rsep과 CPTPP 모두 궁극적인 목표를 위한 아시아 태평양 지역의
You talked about how Rsep and CPTPP both uphold the apex idea of open regionalism and how it can serve to build a broader free trade zone. And you also talked about how Korea, China, and Japan can make further efforts under the Rsep framework. We have a question from Abraham Han related to this. And the question is that do we need a separate Korea, China, Japan FTA when the Rsep is a de facto tripartite agreement? And I think you just mentioned that those efforts need to be made to further integrate the RVC. Professor Shinoda mentioned how the liberalization rate in terms of goods is 80 to 90%. And we believe that in order to increase the liberalization rate, an FTA between Korea, China, Japan is needed apart from the Rsep. And I think our speakers from Korea, China, and Japan seem to agree that a separate Korea, China, Japan FTA is needed under the Rsep framework. And so, Professor Xie, now I would like to invite you for your comments and ideas on how to further develop Rsep.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Kim. So let me provide some additional thoughts about the future of Rsep. And of course, the first important issue is the enlargement of the Rsep. Currently, Hong Kong and Bangladesh have indicated their intention to join the Rsep. And it's easy for Hong Kong because Hong Kong already signed trade and investment agreement with ASEAN. So it's an ASEAN plus one FTA. It's harder for Bangladesh because of its development stage. India, I think it's very unlikely that India would join the Rsep in the future, largely because of the trade deficit with China. As you mentioned, so far, in addition to United Kingdom, China and Taiwan have applied to join the CPTPP. And as Ambassador Kim alluded to, under WTO and APEC, Taiwan and China are considered as separate entities for a very simple reason, because they do not and cannot control each other's trade regimes. It's very clear that Japan and Australia support Taiwan's CPTPP membership. The Taiwanese government is concerned about Malaysia and Peru, which may be influenced by Beijing. But currently, Malaysia and Peru have not ratified the CPTPP. But for this political reason, it's very unlikely that Taiwan will apply to join the Rsep. And CPTPP and Rsep, in my view, are complementary, and as what I said before, and because we need to provide different menus for different people. And here we provide different trade deals for countries with very different development stages. I also agree with Professor Kim that it's very important for us and for Rsep members to enhance the function of Rsf Secretariat. For one very simple reason, the Rsf Secretariat can consolidate existing development project under ASEAN Plus One FTA, and that will be hugely beneficial to developing countries in the region. Thank you very much, Ambassador Kim.
네, 시혜 교수님 감사합니다.
Thank you, Professor Xie. So Hong Kong and Bangladesh have also applied for accession. I did not know this. I hope that Rsep will continue to increase its membership so that it will be able to include all of the countries in our region. And the theme of our discussion was Rsep, but I think we also talked extensively about CPTPP. And as I mentioned before, there are many countries who are joining Rsep and CPTPP at the same time. So I think, we can give each other positive feedback. So as Professor Xie mentioned, so that this would help, I think, to make Rsep and CPTPP to be more complementary. And at the end of the day, I think this will help to create a free trade zone here in the Asian region. And one thing I would also like to add is that Rsep, I'm sure you all agree, is an evolving process. So there is room for Rsep to continue to grow and improve in terms of its level and quality, and also in terms of its scope of application and also its membership. So Rsep is a newborn baby. It's not even gone into effect. So it took us a lot of time to reach where we are right now. So Rsep is in its initial stages. So I hope that many countries will support Rsep so that Rsep will continue to further develop. And I'm sure that all of our participants will agree on this point. So we are behind schedule, but I would like to thank our panelists for their active participation and for sharing with us their input. With this, we would like to conclude the third session. I would once again like to thank our panelists for joining us despite their very busy schedule. So thank you very much for joining us. And I think that through our discussion today, we were able to deepen our understanding about Rsep and also think about the position or the perspective of the different countries in the region. So it was a good opportunity to take stock of what has been happening with regard to Rsep. So I hope that next year we will be able to have face-to-face meetings because I'm really hoping that the COVID situation will improve. So with this, we would like to conclude the third session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Kim. Now we wrap up the morning session. Please come back at 2 p.m. for the last session of the forum, which is a special session in collaboration with the Ministry of Land, Infrastructure, and Transport of the Republic of Korea. Panels will discuss on promoting human and material resource exchanges through East Asia Railway Network. I hope to meet you all again at 2 p.m. Thank you.